All right, today we're going to be investigating the question on What If Investigations, the series. The question is, what if we're using the wrong model of reality? And I'll tell you, I'm worried about our civilization. I'm worried about us. I'm worried about you. And the reason why is because what I've started to realize after studying so many different traditions all across the world, I just got back from Thailand and India, is that there's so many different models of reality, and oftentimes what I've noticed is that there seems to be, especially with what's in play in reality right now, what we're seeing unfold in reality right now, is there's a high chance that if our model of reality is distorted, so to speak, I'm not saying it's completely right or completely wrong, but if there's some distortion to it, we can be orienting, or you might be, or I might be, this is my worry, orienting our lives towards a goal that is designed. I'm going to pick my words carefully. Question anything and everything, by the way, that I say. I'm not trying to give you the absolute answer. The whole point is to have a thought experiment. What if we are? All right? So think about it. Now, if we are having the wrong model of reality, then we have a high chance that that maybe over time, if we understand humans, which we'll get into in a second, we'll talk about cunning of reason, we'll talk about Hegel, and how if humans are trying to get power, it's in their best interest, if they'd like to get power, a lot of the time, to not tell us the whole truth if they know what it is, because that would threaten the structure. Potentially, okay? This is a thought experiment. But first, let's back up a little bit and let's go one step at a time. First step is, what even is a model of reality? If you're not familiar with that term, you can think of it as the structure, the way that you see the world. You could say that your model is a worldview, okay? But you could also say that it's not even just world. If you take world out of the equation, it's your view of everything. And so as you can see, if you can see here, if you're on audio, if you're listening in podcast form, I've got a lot of different words on the board. Who, what, where, how, why, reality, possible. What is possible? What is reality? What is knowledge? What is value? And what is valuable? Even the definition of value, but also basically deciding what we should do. And this is a really important one, who you are. That's why this is number one on this side. So all of these all lead into what we can say is a view of everything, perspective, but what it really is what we're going to be calling today a model. But another orienting factor is this model will tell you what is real and what is not real, what is worth it to pursue. And I'm actually a little bit concerned, or a lot of bit concerned, and I have been for a long time, that our civilization may be orienting towards a model that is not the most accurate and may be distorted. And I'm not the first one to come up with this kind of worry, or really to realize that this could be a potential for humans. Curiously, as I looked throughout history for really evidence that this could be true, because I started to feel that way about my own life. And you can probably relate that when you were younger, you found out things didn't work like you thought they did. Whether you were brought up in a certain belief system about anything, what your parents thought, what institutions told you was happening, it just wasn't accurate. And the question is, how far does that go? And I think one of the most brilliant, and I've said this for years on the channel, one of the most brilliant, if not the best, explanation of how this could be possible was given by the first place I went when I left the US. The first stop was Athens, and it was Plato. And I love ancient Greek philosophy. It's one of my favorites, if not my most favorite. Hey, there's a lot of great philosophies and worldviews out there, but I think Plato was dialed is what I'm trying to say. So I'm not going to be able to draw. I'm not that good of a drawer. I didn't take art. Still working on my art skills. So we're going to actually transition to the mind map, because I want to go over what I would say is the greatest metaphor. You can call it allegory. It's called Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And I want to explain it to you, because if you understand this might be one of the most important things, in my view, you understand philosophically in your entire life. Because if you don't get Plato's Cave, you have a high chance of being easily manipulated. All right, let's load into our map here. All right, so Plato's Cave. This is an artistic representation of Plato's Cave. And so let's go through the analogy and let's see how we can relate it to our reality. All right, so what we find is we've got these people that are chained to a wall, and they've been chained to the wall since birth. And what they're looking at is some things moving on the wall, as you can see here, right, on the left. And as we have the outsider view, they're not able to see these things. But what's happening behind them is that there are people that are holding up objects that are being lit up by a fire. And so the fire provides the light, and it's creating shadows on the wall that the prisoners are watching. And the idea kind of goes like this. Imagine you were chained to the wall since birth, and all you've seen are these things moving on the wall. And there's different ways to go about this analogy. But you can imagine that somehow, some way, you were able to get up from being chained to the wall. Your chain came undone, and you went out, and you saw what nobody else in the cave has ever seen. And that is the light. You see the sun. You wouldn't actually know what these things are, because it would be so painful to take this light in, because your eyes have never seen anything so bright before. So it's going to take your eyes a second to adjust. That's why you can see his hand covering his eyes here. And so he can't really see at first. It's super uncomfortable. But after a while, his eyes adjust. He finds out, oh, this is actually reality. This is the real sun. Fire represents, in some sense, the fake sun. And the whole idea here is this, is that if this prisoner who escaped and saw really reality, not the fake reality that has been portrayed by the objects that are creating a shadow on the wall, by those that are actually, you could say in some sense, they are controlling them. So the people holding up the objects that create the shadows, they are perpetuating what we could call an illusion. You could call it many different things. And so if this prisoner who found out the truth was to go back in and tell these other people that they are actually not seeing what reality is, then Plato's idea was they would want to unalive him. Because to them, what's real is not this abstract idea of there being an outside and some sort of sun or whatever. There's a actual real light. I'm looking at a fake light. I'm looking at a false light. That's a really important term we'll use for many episodes, by the way. False light. And so now I think for the best evidence, let's actually go to Plato's book called The Republic, and let's see what he wrote specifically about this part, in which Socrates is talking to Glaucon. And so it's a back and forth dialogue, and Socrates is describing the allegory of the cave to Glaucon. So Socrates says, "What do you think then? When they recall where they used to live, and the backward wisdom of that place, and the fellow prisoners they once had, would they not think that this change is fortunate for them? And then would they not pity those who stayed behind?" Glaucon says, "No question.
I got to think of some different voices here. Socrates says, what if some honors, praise, and gifts were bestowed on them by other cave dwellers while they are still in the cave for their superior ability to detect the passing shadows, to remember best in which sequence those shadows usually moved, which of them went before, and which following after, and which moved altogether, and to predict how the shadows would move in the future based on their past observations? Do you think they would care for such honors or even envy the ones who were honored and considered powerful among the cave dwellers? Or do you think they would rather choose, quote, to become servants of a poor man, to quote Homer from the Odyssey, and to endure anything rather than admire such things and live in that way? Glucon says, yes, I think that they would rather suffer anything than accept this sort of life.
All right, we're back to the drawing board. Now, question for you. How do we now determine which model is even correct in the first place? Well, I think that it should do multiple different things. Now, the first thing it should do is, well, first off, if you know Greek philosophy, you know that there's the big three. Now, the big three are considered Plato, then you've got actually Socrates above, right? Plato, and then Aristotle. All right, now Socrates and Plato are obviously very correlated, and Aristotle comes after, tutor of Alexander the Great. Now, Aristotle was focused more on empirical data, and in a lot of ways is kind of very different from the way that Plato saw the world. But I think Aristotle did nail something. He nailed the idea of if something is true, we should be able to observe it in the world. And so when we ask ourselves if something is correct, then we should be able to test it, really. It should do multiple things. It should, number one, give us an accurate idea of the past. Okay? Past. It should make, really, let's change idea. What it should really do is make the past make sense to us. All right? And number two, really we're talking about time. All right? With all three of these. So we have three dimensions of time, we could say, for right now. Past, present, and future. So it should have the power, a model, to give us an understanding of what has happened, what is happening right now, and what will happen. But if you stop here, you are kind of missing out a little bit. And so if a model just does these things, think about what we just talked about. There's a reason why we talked about that first. If it only does these three, then what about the cave? Because if I had a system, a model of reality that really predicted how the shadows have moved in the past, well, shit. We could say that's correct, right? Because, hey, this is how they used to move. I've got evidence of that. Maybe even recorded the shadows, and you're like, oh, I can explain why this had this trajectory. And then you could say the same thing of, okay, well, I know that the shadow kind of like you remember on the TV screens how you would have like the ball that would go towards every corner, right? Or the word. And you would want it to hit the corner exactly where. Let's say you could predict that. You could predict the shadow reality. Okay, so you get that, and then you're like, well, it's done this 10 times in a row, this particular shadow, or it seems to always do this. So these are the laws of how reality works. And I can show you that it's going to work this way, and maybe it does. But at the end of the day, the problem is, what if it's still a shadow? See it! We're in for a troubled time, if all of this model, this is the reality we need to face as humans right now. I'm going to actually write this in red. Big question I want to ask you is this. What if your model of reality that you think is correct does predict the future? It does show what has happened in the past and what is happening right now. But the question I want to ask you is this. What if it has all been designed as shadows on a cave wall? And the cave is metaphorical, obviously, meaning it's an illusion that while it makes sense, it's still in the cave. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you something. Here's my gift to you. All right? What we're going to do, because I only got so much boardroom, let's take this out for a sec. All right? Now, what I want to give you is what I call the cave test. Let's rewrite that. Okay? So, let's say a model of reality should be able to do the three things we discussed. All right? The three temporal variations of the same idea should help us to do these things, to understand it. But we have so many different models that compete against this. All right, so just because your model of reality can explain these things doesn't necessarily mean it's correct. So we need to add some variables to this. So if we take this and then we add evidence, okay? So just because something can explain something doesn't mean it's right. So if your model, let's say, explains what's happening, but it doesn't have the best evidence to do so, then how can we make sure that that model is the most correct? Meaning, there are a lot of competing models of reality that are close to the same thing. Maybe they have different variations. So we need to look at the evidence of these. So the first step is, does it help us to understand it? The second step is, what has good evidence? But then we run into the same issue. And this is why this is a whole thought experiment for you to think about this. All right? Even if it does have evidence of it happening, what if your model of reality, I really hope that all of humanity could hear this. I really wish all of humanity. In fact, let's just say, all of humanity, listen up. What if your model of reality, yes, it can show what's happened in the past, what's happening right now, and what might happen. Maybe you've got a book that you think tells you what's going to happen, and it makes sense depending on what has happened. But the question is the question of Plato's cave. What if your model of reality has been designed to be a shadow and what we can call a false light script? Meaning, if we just take a look at our worldview, our model, and we think to ourselves, yeah, it makes sense, but we don't see how this could have been scripted into reality to then keep us on a treadmill, on a hamster wheel, on some sort of distorted path of understanding what reality is in order to control us. So we need to look at, and we can call this the cave test. And we can also refer, in terms of, if you want to see an example of this, we can refer to Dune. Now, metaphorically, what happens in Dune? In the series, I'm going to spoil it for you if you haven't seen it. The idea is Paul and the Bene Gesserit script into reality a narrative as to who Paul is and what he's about. And they do so in order to convince people that, hey, yeah, he's that guy. All right? And if they believe that he's that guy, then they follow the narrative, and those that seek power for the sake of power, which, by the way, let's bring in Hegel here. So Hegel thought of this idea. Okay, one of the greatest philosophers came after Kant, and we're going to call it, see if I can write it big enough for you here, cunning of reason. Now, cunning of reason basically means that people pursue their own personal aims, and you can see this in the world right now. If you want to know any kind of model that makes the most sense when we look at the world and really doesn't have a cave test risk, then Hegel's theory on people, which we can call cunning of reason, gives us a really good explanation. So what am I saying? Look out into the world. What do you see? You see people who are just pursuing their own aims because they want power. Okay, and those people have manipulated reality to a certain extent that they did get a level of power. But what happens is that we can see that now, especially with the events playing out in my time that this is being recorded. And so Hegel would call this cunning of reason. And then what happens is that because of cunning of reason, we have an unintended consequence. And the unintended consequence of the people that pursue the aim, especially that we see right now, and it's been happening, in my opinion, all throughout history, this leads to a higher development of society, or of what he called, okay, this is going to be a little bit difficult to understand, but what he called Geist. Now, Geist is a hard word to translate from German. Now, there are some people that say that the correct translation of Geist is spirit. That's why his book was called Phenomenology of Spirit. But the thing is it's really hard to translate. So we can say that it's a combination, and we can kind of speculate that it's somewhere in between spirit, somewhere in between mind, somewhere in the vicinity of collective, you could say, consciousness. Now, the problem that we see with cunning of reason is that a lot of people suffer. But the whole idea here is that even though in our world right now you see so many people pursuing their own aims, they get power, and we see the absolute ridiculous, heinous things that are happening behind the scenes, Hegel's view was that this is all part of the structure of reality that maybe we can't see, in the same way that Plato's cave, the people who hold up the objects in order to trick the people in the cave to watching the shadows and thinking that that's reality, the people that are perpetuating the illusion, so to speak, are actually causing a whole nother evolution of what we can call Geist, spirit, mind, collective consciousness. Or really, I think the best way to word it simply would be to simply say, for the collective consciousness or the spirit of humanity to understand itself better. And there is many different debates on what do you actually call these things? What's the correct words for what I'm saying here? Some people might say for the collective mind to know itself better, for the spirit of the times to get closer to understanding itself better. But that happens through people pursuing their own aims. I think this is an absolutely fascinating concept. And what I'm trying to tell you here is that just because the way that we view history right now, let's take a little bit of a turn. The way that we have viewed the past, present, and future, I mean, especially when we have the past, we call the past history. And oftentimes, what are we told? That history really doesn't have any continuity. You just got scribes, essentially, who study it and it might have some continuity, but there's really not an underlying structure. This is what we're told. to the way that it works. And it's kind of random. And I think that when you really contemplate the cave test in itself, you think to yourself, well, I mean, this is kind of mysterious. History has no really intelligible thing besides events happen. Could that be in itself, if we apply the cave test, could that be a false light script, so to speak, an idea that was implanted in there to convince us that we can't really understand why things happen? Really what I'm asking now is, what if we have the wrong model of reality? Okay, if we do, we might be in the cave. And then the next logical question is, if we're going to understand different models, well, what if our model of history in itself is inaccurate? What if it's incorrect? Or what if it's distorted a little bit? And I'm not trying to make absolute claims here again, and I could be wrong. Remember that. Just really think about this yourself. Tell me what you think in the comments. But what if history is wrong in the sense that the way we look at history, or what if history in itself, or what we call history, what if the way it was written by those who had embodied the idea of cunning of reason, those people pursuing certain aims for themselves? What if history in itself isn't really objective in its outlook? So if we're going to try to figure out this puzzle of history, let's figure out the definitions of some different terms that Hegel had to describe history. I find this one of the most fascinating, if the most fascinating, ideas of how history actually works. So it's very different than what you've probably been told about the nature of it. So let's start at the top left. The Owl of Minerva. This is a classic Hegel line. And the idea is simply this: understanding comes after the development of ideas, or the development of history in itself. And you can think about it like this. Look at your life. How much of your life makes sense in the moment? Probably not that much, right? Compared to, maybe it does make sense, but compared to, let's say, your knowledge now of the nature of things, and you're looking at your life 5 years ago, you're like, oh, those things make sense. So the idea is that history or life is better understood backwards rather than forwards. It's definitely been my experience. I don't know about you, Chief. But let's carry on, shall we? So he had this idea of dialectic. And it's, you take a concept, which we can call a model of reality for our specific case here, and in that it has internal tension. You could call this a contradiction. And the idea with this is that not only models of reality, that's just one aspect. I'm completely missing a different part of Hegel's theories. But remember, we only have so much time, and I don't want to make this 3 hours long, which I could. But we're not just talking about models of reality. We're talking about all of history has tensions within it. And those tensions or contradictions, whichever word you want to use here, it's debated, you can call that something that creates a development. And you can think of it like this. The tension that you have on your muscles when you're working out causes your muscles to develop or become stronger. Now, if we're talking about Hegel, I'm not saying bro was jacked working out. It doesn't look like it from the pictures. No, no shade. Listen, that wasn't what he was about. It's all good. This is fire. We should probably focus on this. But the idea is that your muscles, when they break, or they micro tear, that tension that you put on them, it's literally called time under tension, that creates development of muscles. Now apply this to history. All right? That tension of things not going the greatest, the contradictions, this creates the development of the entire collective mind. Remember, we just discussed Geist. You can call it mind, spirit. You can call it collective consciousness. Something in the vicinity of that is what we're talking about. So, and I don't know what the hell's going on right now. I had a cough drop to get my throat lathered, and I can't stop with the saliva. Anyways, I hope you can't pick that up on the mic. Let's continue. So, when we're thinking about history, we're thinking about concept, tension, and the development. So, part of this is what he called offhabung. And you could kind of split this up into 3 different terms, because remember, we're translating from German. It's very difficult to get an exact translation. Oftentimes, it's described as somewhere in between to cancel something, to preserve something, and to elevate something. And so that's kind of what's happening with ideas. You're kind of canceling an idea, but there's a specific term you had for that, or in the canceling and preserving. You can think of offhabung. You cancel and preserve an idea. What does that really mean? He called a part of it determinate negation. Now that is what we can call a targeted correction of a specific limit that has. And a very easy way to understand this is there are limits or contradictions within things, but there's also truth within things. So it's like you have part of the truth, but you don't have the full thing. So if the way that history works is that metaphors, models contain parts of the truth, well, you want to preserve part of it that is true or correct. You want to cancel the parts that are not, and you want to elevate and bring in the other ideas that are closer. And so that's kind of the process that we're talking about when we talk about dialectic. It's the internal tension that creates the development. And so that internal micro process is that. I mean, we're doing this with our lives all the time. Let's say your model of reality probably includes some variation of this. Things aren't going great, so you're going to cancel some habits, you're going to preserve some habits, and then you're going to basically try to elevate the development of your spirit or your mind on a micro level in order to suffer less, or in order to, depending on if we're talking a Hegel interpretation here, in order to know yourself or become self-knowing. All right? Or to understand yourself better. But I digress. We continue on to immediate versus mediated knowledge. And so when we're thinking about our model of reality, you have immediate models and mediated models. Hegel thought that immediate knowledge is usually, I'm going to paraphrase here, could be wrong, not really usually correct. And this is the same thing as the famous quote from Socrates, the Great. The unexamined life is not worth living. And Hegel's saying that in his own terms of when people have immediate knowledge and they just think things are as they completely are told that they are, that's probably not it, Chief. So it's similar to, if you're looking at the cave in Plato's Allegory, you're looking at the shadows, that's immediate because you think, oh, the shadows are just what they are. And this might seem simplistic to you, but think about our society. So many people, and I got this traveling all over the world. I mean, when I went to Thailand, I went to Greece, went to India, you see how the belief system, the model, the concepts, the worldview is very much dictated by where you're born. And so where you're born is kind of like your, you could call your philosophy. Some people would call this their religion. But this is oftentimes immediate knowledge, because think about it. How many people have contemplated, and I'm not trying to be savage here, but I'm trying to investigate. How many people have contemplated their immediate knowledge or where they've been raised, and they were like, you know what, I should probably choose between all the different things, all the different worldviews. I should get myself a good understanding. I should look for mediated knowledge or the relational integration into totality. Meaning, I'm going to mediate by taking all these different worldviews, and I'm going to compare and see, you know what, which one do I think actually fits reality? How many people are doing that? Not that many. From what I've seen. I mean, shit, but what do I know? But that also could be on purpose. And I'm not trying to blame people for not doing that. Because part of the model that we see in our reality may be to keep us in such a state of survival that it's very difficult to find time to do that. To have our society have the concepts be focused on the shadows. And that's all you know, because you're just supposed to believe in the immediate knowledge, as Hegel said. That this is what reality is because we're telling you that's what it is. Why don't you... These other things are stupid. As we read from the Republic, Socrates saying, you'd be laughed at, essentially, if you try to come back into the cave and talk about, well, this is what happens. You get laughed at when you look at things in a mediated way in a society that maybe or may not be programmed to convince you to believe in a certain belief system in order to maybe, potentially, perpetuate the shadows or the false light system. False light shadows. But let's continue on. So now that you understand a mediated model, meaning a model that takes into consideration how it integrates into the totality of all the different models, that is more likely to be true. Not saying that's an absolute fact. But if you can find it, it's actually kind of close if you think about it. In some ways, maybe this is a generalization, to the scientific method. I mean, we're looking for evidence in patterns of how does this fit into everything? We're not just going to ignore things because we've been told that it was a certain way. Right? We're going to look at the evidence here, the patterns here. Does it line up? Does it integrate into everything that we see? I mean, look, there's people looking for theories of everything for a long time. So they're on that path of mediated knowledge already. And so then we have the concepts from Hegel of in itself versus for itself. In itself, you can think of, it's called an sich, and you can think of it as implicit structure not fully articulated, versus for itself, it's a structure that is more explicit. It's become self-aware. And so what this means is that you might have some models of reality that, again, have certain parts that are partly true, other parts that are not, different metaphors. Like you might have, and we'll discuss this deeper in a second, but I'll just kind of give you a tiddly bit a little bit. What I'm saying? Shit, now I can't even remember what I said. I'm talking about, yes, dreams. Dreams might give us an idea of a part of reality or a part of the implicit structure, but it might not be the explicit structure, or explicit's hard because we use that word differently nowadays, but it might not be the full thing. And it's the ancient or the old idea, it's not ancient, but the idea of the philosophers looking at the elephant being like, I've got it, but it's only part of the elephant. This is what it's the blind men, I'm going to say this better, blind men that are all looking at an elephant and they're trying to feel it, and they're feeling certain parts of the elephant and they think they know what the elephant is. And so what I'm saying is maybe our models of reality right now are just parts of that elephant instead of the whole thing. And the problem or the issue that we see is that people are very convinced that they're part of the elephant that they've been told, or really what we can call the in and out group idea. They've been told that their idea is absolutely right and everybody else is wrong. And so here's a question for you. If we were to think like a person who was pursuing their own aims, cunning of reason, type C, like we just talked about, right? Imagine that you're pursuing that. What would you want to do? You would want to create in and out groups where you thought that you absolutely had the factual 100%, because if you could skew how people looked at history to convince them that history doesn't develop, you just have the right idea, you've got it 100% dialed in, Everybody else got it wrong. Well, what can you do then? You can play this little game where you got all these different pawns on this board, and you create these different groups in which the groups then duke it out. So you turn people against each other by convincing them that they have the explicit structure instead of the implicit structure. And because people just want to be right, you can appeal to the shadow, in Carl Jung terms, the shadow complex within people, to want to be better than, and to say that we have it, you don't, to be right. People oftentimes, especially in primitive societies, really care about these things, right? People in primitive societies, I think, and oftentimes a way to tell if you're in a primitive society is, can you look around and see how people are just trying to be right? Like a primitive society, the marker is, or the way we tell is, are people trying to be right, or are they trying to figure out what the truth is? Because if it's more about being right, it's more about status signals and achieving a level of success, which all may be mediated by shadows determining what your success is. All right, so now that you understand all of this by Hegel, you understand we oftentimes see it better after it's done or towards the end of, you could say, an era or a process of development. The tension occurs, the contradiction in many different areas. Now we can see, okay, if history develops over time, if that's true, or if that's correct, and ideas develop and we move closer to what is true or what's actually happening through the process of history, then we would need to eventually, like a game, patch or update our understanding of the way that the world works, so that one, we're not tricked, and two, so that we can see through the structures that have been created, or whether it's technology or through the understanding or knowledge, the mediated knowledge that we now have. Maybe things are different than what we've been told, all right? Now, I want you to take one more thing into consideration before we hit up all the different ways of seeing the world, and it's this. Don't you think it makes sense that in a time period that for the first time in known history, we may want to update our model of reality to not just be tribe-based? Because think about it. Imagine if humans just said for a second, shit, maybe this tribe, this group of people has a part, the implicit structure of this part of nature, or this part of the nature of reality itself. What if they got this right, but maybe they're a little bit distorted in an area? Imagine if we worked together to create a unified model of reality, and we practiced a form of mediated knowledge to say, you know what, you've got a little bit over here. Let's practice a form of dialectic between each other, because as Hegel said, we can only understand each other between two beings, create that level of higher understanding. So then we use that to develop a unified model of reality, because the internet, because we have such a profound way to connect that we didn't have for most of known human history. I couldn't just go to a different part of the world so easily and study or talk to them through the scrying device, right? So now that I can do that, and I can have these conversations and we can really talk to each other without so much tribal warfare. I mean, we're trying here, but that's still happening. But I think it's about time that we ask the question, which models are closer to truth and which ones are not? And I think the only way we can do that is to put all the different options on the table and really ask ourselves, are we willing to be wrong? Are we willing to be like, you know what, maybe I had some parts distorted because of I was born into this, or this happened and then this, and then I thought this way, but now I see with this evidence that you're giving me, this is how reality might be, or this is how this aspect of reality. I mean, because a philosophy, a worldview, it's complex, right? You have a lot of different aspects. And so my goal here is to help you to think about the way that you move through the world so that, number one, your worldview or your model, because remember the title is, what if we have the wrong view of reality? What if we have the wrong model of reality? Well, if we consider that we have the wrong one, maybe that's true, then we can start to move towards more coherence within ourselves. And you could say, do things in a way that is higher level, or a higher level of coherence, which as a civilization I think would be nice, is if we start to move in that direction instead of degenerate. And so, I mean, now I'm just going on a tangent, but the idea here is pretty simple. This is how history may work. If this is true, then it would make the most sense to take all the different concepts, to see the internal tensions of those different concepts or models of reality, and practice the form of mediated relational integration and see how they all come together into the totality of human development, or the Geist, or the mind of all of humanity, so that we can do a better job at integrating together instead of coming at each other from the in and out group standpoint. Because at the end of the day, don't forget, we're all humans. At least I think. No, but for real, humans need to get together and figure out what's going on. I mean, we're in such a time period where if we don't do this right now, I think we're at major risk for a reversal. Because I'm not even insinuating with this model that history is always going forwards. I'm saying that according to Hegel, this is how history works. Maybe there also is a cycle to it as well, which would explain things like you see Graham Hancock talking about Younger Dryas impact, meltwater, pulse 1b, other areas of interest of mine. So when you look at this, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a linear model only as well, but it is an integrative model that I think is really helpful to understanding the nature of things. So now let's do the last part here, and let's do the concepts. Let's think about their internal tensions. What is an actual development? What needs to be canceled? What needs to be preserved? What needs to be elevated? I mean, that's why we're investigating, right? To figure these things out. So, where do we go from here? Well, as I'm investigating this, I actually started to realize it made the most sense to now go to metaphors to explain models of reality. But I want to explain to you the logic as to why we're going to go to metaphors instead of directly to comparing different religions, philosophies, these type of things, or scientific theories even. We're not going to go there yet. We will get there, but not yet. And the reason why is I'm going to give you a couple quotes and explain them. So, first quote is, quote, "Our ordinary conceptual system, in terms of which we both think and act, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature." And that's by George Lakoff in a book called Metaphors We Live By. And so if we combine that with a Carl Jung quote, he said, quote, "The symbol is the best possible expression of something that cannot be fully known." And it seems as though we can't fully know the nature of reality right now. But what we're trying to do with this investigation is see how close we can get. And so here's kind of a structure that I can give you to understand this in your head. So we've got three parts to this structure. I mean, the first part of it is actually the word structure. So what it seems to go like, how this reality seems to work, is something like this. There is a structure to reality, and that's what we're trying to figure out. Now, that structure seems to express itself as symbols. And that's why Carl Jung said, the symbol is the best possible expression of something that can't be fully known. And so that's why one of my favorite books, we read this in the book club, A Man and His Symbols, right over there. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, to get yourself deeper into that book. But the idea is that symbols are hard to actually describe using language. And so they oftentimes get articulated through different metaphors. And these metaphors we often see are something like life is a dream, that life is a journey, and life is a test we see. We see life is a conflict, life is a battle between good and evil. Life is a school, you could even see. And so what we're trying to figure out is the thing that actually underpins the models that we will eventually compare. Because I think if we ignore that, then we're not going to the deepest level first. We're kind of going to the surface level to just create evidence arguments. When the model that we're using itself, which we can call, I'm going to introduce to you this concept that I think it's important that you remember. This concept called meta model. All right? The reason why this is important is because the meta model is the thing that structurally informs what our model of reality is. But most people don't realize that the way that they think is in symbols. The way that we think is in metaphors. And so if we don't address those metaphors or examine those metaphors, oftentimes we can be misled into what we just discussed. Being tricked by shadows on a cave wall in order to distract us. And so if we have the wrong model, that's one thing. But also, this is how deep we're going in this investigation, because we really want to get to the truth. I mean, I really want to get to the truth. I'll say that. We need to go even deeper to the symbols and the metaphors that we think in. And so once we do that, once we understand the meta model, then we can understand the models that get articulated through the meta models, okay? Are you with me? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, and then once we have the model of reality, this is what we discussed at the very beginning. That is going to include the specific claims to reality. And so just remember, as we go through these metaphors, and I'm going to state this multiple times in this investigation, it's important. We're not really comparing the metaphorical models to a specific claim. Those aren't operating, that's a category error is what I'm saying. Those are not operating on the same level, because your metaphors are going to predate, and they're going to be that which you could say religion or philosophy or even scientific theories, which we'll discuss in a second, even those express themselves in metaphorical ways. And you might not think that they do yet, but I'm going to show you through my investigation, that's what I've found. So the logical leap that we're making here is that even though it does make sense to go to specific religious claims or scientific claims, that those are operating not at the deepest level, those are at the surface level, let's actually first go to the meta model, deepest level, to see if there are similarities. Because if there are similarities, then that's intriguing. Then we might have different metaphors that are converging to describe, in these different religions or philosophies throughout history, are all converging to describe a similar structure. And then that right there is the sweet, sweet nectar we're looking for. Because if we have different civilizations throughout history that independently come to very similar conclusions as to how they symbolically describe reality and articulate that through metaphor, and if those metaphors are very similar or they converge on a similar set of ideas that are articulated through those metaphors, I'm trying to really explain this here, then we might have some structure that shows or that is closer to what reality is. And if we can do that, then we can start to develop a model around that, or we can investigate which model is the closest to that. And then the goal is that we can move closer to truth. So we can move closer to coherence, or to what reality actually is, beyond what we called earlier false light. False light. We want to be in the real light. But what actually is the real light? How does that work? let's continue the investigation now by going to all the different metaphors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to list out all the different, I would say, popular metaphors that I just talked about that you see in many different traditions. You see life as a dream, as a stage. You see that more in the Shakespearean era. You see it as a test, a battle. And the idea here is taking that Hegelian idea is that we're structurally articulating through metaphor different iterations given our technological advancement of that civilization and what metaphors we have access to. We're articulating a similar structure, potentially. But first, let's write out the metaphors and see the different layers that are encoded in each metaphor. And let's see which metaphor, if we have one, does in this investigation lead to a combination or the best description overall.
Now, last thing, I want to avoid being misinterpreted, especially by skeptics. So here's what I am and what I'm not saying. Just because humans describe reality in metaphorical terms, which you'll see, doesn't mean that those metaphors are exactly what then the truth is. But what it does mean is that we have candidates for the best meta model of reality. And so, if different civilizations keep isolating structural dimensions of experience, then each metaphor can become a hypothesis, a theory that we then investigate further. It's not necessarily a conclusion in itself. And so whatever metaphorical framework integrates the most dimensions coherently, that then becomes our strongest candidate. And then we don't just believe it there, we keep investigating. So before we get into, like I said, the religions and scientific things, let's examine the structural metaphors themselves and find the best candidate and take that one further. Now, what metaphors have humans actually used?
For example, what do you experience every night? You experience dreaming. And what does that encode into like the structure? What is the structure of dreaming? You're immersed in the dream, right? The dream feels real. It feels like there's layers to it. Like I seriously had a dream a while ago that I woke up into another dream. Inception type shit, right? So in terms of the structure of a dream, you also have a limited awareness. Oftentimes it feels real. We don't know we're dreaming, but in a dream, you have the possibility to awaken, so to speak, within that dream, to become lucid or to understand that you are in fact in what we call a dream. So that's one way to say it. If we keep going, we have a stage. Now, a stage in the structure encodes the ideas of a role. Think about it. Have you ever done improv? You have the role of coming up with it on the spot, or sometimes you have a script and you have an audience, you have a narrative. And the Shakespeare famous quote saying that all the world essentially is a stage in itself. Interesting. So he thought it was a stage. You've had other people tell you that life is a journey and that it has a progression to it. There's a direction to it. There's obstacles you have to overcome, and there's a transformation in this dream. Not in the dream, but in the journey itself. And then we have number 4, which is a test. Life as a test. It's an evaluation. It's a consequence. Like you have consequences from the test. And then you have a standard in the test. You need to achieve blank in life or else. And you have a performance grade. And sometimes that grading is binary. Maybe there's different levels to that grade, or something or someone grades you. And so you also have the idea of life being a battle. And you oftentimes hear this in religious connotations. It's a battle, it's an opposition between good and evil, or a form of good and evil. Remember, everybody always wants to be the good guys. The problem we have with humanity, on a side note, the problem we have with humanity is that we can't tell the difference between truth and falsehood. And so, if we could, then we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. But we are actually stuck in what feels like a limited awareness state. We might not be fully stuck, but we feel stuck. Some of us are, and we think that something is true when it's not. And we're unwilling to face ourselves and say, hey, maybe this isn't the most accurate view of reality. But nobody chooses a view because they think that it's false. People don't go around like, hey, this view sucks, low-key the worst. It's probably not true, but it's right. It's in fact right. I don't think so. So they pick it because they think that it's right. That's the point of what I'm saying. So life as a battle is a struggle. It's a risk. You could lose. There's competition in it. And so you actually could have a competition or a battle between not only you, but forces greater than yourself. And so then we have the metaphorical understanding of life as a school. And so that's more of a learning model. It's not as intense because you're in a school. You're kind of, in some sense, meant to not know how it works. You have feedback that you'll be getting. Oftentimes, you'll have a social dynamic in that school, whether it's between you and the teacher or you and other students. And you'll have skill acquisition. That's the big one from school, is you're acquiring skills. You understand that. You aren't supposed to come in knowing how it works and then just be kind of like number 4, tested like you understood how it works. And so when we now take a big picture view, I want to ask you, which one of these do you think is the most accurate? And what you'll find is probably something very peculiar if you think about it. And it's this. What if all the different metaphors or structural articulations we have of reality all show up in one model? Like if you look at life as a dream or a stage or a journey or a test or a battle or a school, you're going to kind of see that some of these overlap. Like a test is something that happens in a school. And a test can happen in a battle. A test can happen in a journey. A test can happen on a stage, like in a play, if you're acting out on a stage. That's what that means. And you could even be tested in a dream. And so you can kind of see that these kind of meld together. And what I am asking you is, when we have all these different metaphors, what if these different models are implicit structures? Meaning they're just part of the full picture of what we are experiencing as humans. And so, for example, let's keep going. So you could have a school that is teaching you, or the other way around, is teaching you how to act on a stage. And so life as a stage or a school, those can be linked together. And oftentimes, I also want you to think about that a battle can be part of a school. A school can be part of a test. A test can be part of a journey. And a school can feel like a journey. And you can wake up from a dream and realize it was a school. Or you can wake up from a dream and feel like, wow, that was a journey. You can wake up from the dream and feel like, wow, that felt like I was just acting on a stage in my dream. You can wake up from a dream and feel like that was a test from God in your dream, or whatever. You could feel like you just had a battle in your dream. You see how they kind of all go together, all right? Now, let's take a look at, as we go along, well, actually, before we do that, one more thing I wanted to do was, when you think about the concept of a dream, the unique thing about the dream, specifically in comparison to a lot of these other ones, is the immersion aspect. And so the immersion, layered reality, limited awareness, the awakening possibility, that really speaks to Plato's cave. And so I think the dream aspect is really important, because if we miss the idea that life could be a dream, then we miss that it could be not the ultimate reality. Because oftentimes, these other ones, you're not getting the direct exposure to the idea that this may not be all that there is. Could be coming from a different reality, could be immersed in this reality that doesn't feel real, or may not be real. We have a limited awareness in it. That's specific. One of the most important points of all of these metaphors is this particular point, the limited awareness point. All right? So if we don't admit that our reality or model is limited in some respect, we are really at risk for the cave test failing, meaning that if we don't see that we could be wrong, is what I'm saying. We have a big possibility that our model might be designed to pit us against one another. So if Hegel is correct in his view that mediated knowledge, when we compare different viewpoints, we can see that truth is the integrated whole of all of these, especially with the least amount of contradictions. So we see that all these different metaphors are representing something about the nature of this reality. So whether you think that reality is a dream, a stage, a journey, a test, a battle, or it's a school, my question to you is, what do we have in our reality that represents or can be all of these at once? So what has the most evidence then? G-A-M-E. For the first time in history, we have a word or a model that can be all of these to a certain extent. So what am I trying to say? All of these metaphors seem to bizarrely correlate to the same structure or the same idea, and that is reality as a game. And let me tell you why. Because a game can be immersive, like a dream, but it can have roles and narrative, like a stage, and it can have a script, or it can be improv, it can be like GTA, or it can be like a God of War scripted game, and it can have an audience like a live stream. A game can have a journey with progression, direction, obstacles, and transformation. I mean, it usually does. You can have tests in the game itself that have consequences, evaluations in it. You can have a battle with opposing forces. I mean, look at most games. I mean, you have battle in the game. That's what the game really is about. So what I'm saying is, and by the way, we can also have a school as a game as well. But what I'm saying is, all of these seem to converge on one word. Now, the investigation here continues. I'm not saying that I know for sure that it is a game. I'm not saying that I know for sure that reality is anything. All I'm saying is that it might be. What if it is? All right, so we got to reorient ourselves in this investigation. Where are we at and where are we going? Okay, so we're at the point. Let's revisit the original question. The original question was this. Then really ask yourself this. What if the model of reality that you're using is the wrong model of reality? Well, if that would be the case, a model is a synonym for a worldview. If that is the case, then your identity, or you could actually just say easier, who you think you are, is also probably distorted. And then that would distort the meaning of your life. And a telltale sign that your model of reality is distorted is if your suffering is pretty high. All right? Now, where we go from here is we got to ask ourselves the genuine question that most humans are not willing to ask is, has their model of reality been distorted like Plato told us could happen thousands of years ago? Said that your reality might be like shadows on a cave wall perpetuated by those who are trying to, maybe intentionally, maybe not intentionally, I mean shit, look around, control you, distract you, keep your attention for some reason. I wonder what that would be. And so what we need to do is we need to understand how models work. We need to understand that not only are there models, but there's actually something called meta-models. Now, meta-models are structural articulations that usually come in metaphors. And you can see in many different religious traditions that you have metaphors that basically encode meaning into our lives. And when we take a look at many different civilizations, we find that there are really different metaphors that point to a similar structure. But I also want to say that in a physicalist or materialist worldview, you're actually still using metaphors, but you're just changing the way that you use them. For example, in religious traditions, you might see that this reality is described metaphorically as a test, and that there's consequences for this test, or that it's a cosmic arena between good and evil, and there's conflict. Well, in a materialist worldview, you're just going to twist this a little bit, and you're still going to use the metaphor of it is an arena, reality is an arena, but in the materialist worldview, it's an arena for the survival of the fittest, and there is a conflict, and this would be basically, the journey would be a progression towards higher adaptation. Survival of the fittest produces a progression, which is adaptation. So you can still see that even if you're an atheist, or whatever you want to say, agnostic, you still have metaphors built in. You're still saying coding metaphors. You're still saying mechanistic metaphors. So I'm not even claiming that every metaphor up here, or I'm not even claiming that I have every metaphor up here. That would be impossible. These are just a lot of the popular ones that you see in a lot of poetic kind of ways that we describe reality. So metaphors structurally articulate different aspects of reality. So if we want to go deeper, we need to look at the meta level, which is the structure, the symbolic structure that are really the top level of the way that reality, we see reality even before we get to the point of the model. Now the model, and then you're gonna have the model, and then you're gonna have the claims of that model. And so we can get to the point where we test all those, but I'd say the first thing we need to do is understand that the metaphors really are the highest structural articulation, or really the deepest level, in the same way that you could say that there's a subconscious and then there's a conscious mind. And this is the idea that subconsciously we oftentimes have these metaphors. But I think the main point, the big point, is that we just went through a big explanation of Hegel. And we did so to understand that if our model of reality is distorted, well, that's probably happening because of what Hegel called the cunning of reason. We just went over that. That people pursue certain aims, and those aims are in the pursuit of power for themselves. It's self-centered behavior, essentially. And a different form of this by Nietzsche would be will to power. And so when we have these ideas that people basically pursue their aims of power, this causes distortion in our model of reality, and this is what we're seeing nowadays, it seems as though. And so what Hegel said, though, that is profound, is that he said that even though people do pursue cunning of reason, or their own aims to power, and causes the suffering of many people, they may do this, but it unintentionally produces a higher articulation of ideas. And there's multiple ways that he said this. He said that there was a process of the idea, which you can say there's the idea that is being put out, and then there is a tension or a contradiction within that idea. And then that contradiction is solved in a higher articulation. We just went through Aufhebung, cancel, preserve, elevate is the idea. Now, oftentimes, I didn't say this yet, but another way to easily remember this is the idea of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis of that idea. And so what we should see throughout history with Hegel's viewpoint is that a thesis is proposed, the antithesis of that is put out into reality, or the response to that, and then those two come together to create a synthesis. So there's many different ways to explain this, but the overarching principle or the overarching idea that history works is actually different than what we've been told. And so if Hegel is correct on his ideas of cunning of reason and the way that history develops, and that it's a dynamic process in which spirit, mind, Geist, whatever you want to call it, the collective consciousness, comes to over time create structures that help it to understand itself better. And so if that is true, what we should see is that we should see different ideas that include implicit structures, and that there may be, over time, or we should see, according to Hegel, that a higher structure emerges from really implicit structures over periods of time. And what I'm proposing to you today is that through the cunning of reason, people pursuing their own aims, it causes a higher articulation to be shown. And we might not, like Hegel said with the Owl of Minerva, we may not understand it until the end of its development or later. It's like the idea that life is better understood backwards than it is forwards. So then what I'm saying to you today is that through my investigation, I seem to have found a higher structural articulation. And that includes so many different pieces of evidence that we see through many different traditions throughout history that independently came to their own conclusions as to what the nature of reality is. And then they described that metaphorically. And if we look at all the different metaphors that were used, we can see that there are different aspects of each that describe the nature of our reality. And to go over it quickly again, we've got reality as a dream, which gives us the immersion layer. We've got reality as a stage, which gives us the role layer. We've got reality as a journey, which gives us the progression layer. We've got reality as a test, which gives us the consequences layer. We've got reality as an arena or a battle, which gives us the conflict that we're seeing. And we've got reality as a school, which is reality gives us feedback. All right, and that feedback comes in different forms. You could also put skill acquisition here. And so it seems as though many people throughout history, a ton of people in different civilizations, report that reality works this way. And I want you to ask yourself the question, do you have different aspects of these metaphors that reality seems to work like? Is this true for you in your life? Does your reality feel immersive, like you're in a dream? Does it feel like you've awoken to different layers of reality that you didn't understand, even on like the micro layer? We don't even have to do the different layers of afterlife and all that. You can at least say that there was things that you kind of awakened to. It was like you were sleeping when you were younger. It was like you were in a dream state, a hypnotized kind of state. The same thing with dreaming. Does your reality feel like this? Does it feel like sometimes you're on a stage, like you're playing a role? Does it feel like there's a progression to life, that you're on a journey? Hero's journey, Joseph Campbell, right? Map that out. I think that's a good point to hit on for just a second. Joseph Campbell said, and he documented actually, that throughout many different civilizations, most civilizations, I forget the exact quote, a ridiculous amount, we find a progression structure encoded into their myth. And so that's very much a piece of evidence that maybe reality does resemble a journey. And so we can keep going on. Life feels like a test, whether that's from God or whether it's a test of survival. Arena, school, you get the point. What I'm saying is that reality doesn't seem to just have one of these. It seems to have many of these combined. Okay? Many of these combined. And these aren't the only metaphors. And if that is the case, and if Hegel is correct that throughout history over time, we should see a higher development of ideas, we should see a more accurate structural articulation of what reality is as history unfolds, then we should expect new ideas to come through, or a better articulation of all of these together, a more immersive structure. And I seem to have found through this investigation a likely candidate for what this is. I'm not saying that I know for sure, but I think that it's very interesting that all of these structural metaphors all converge on this same idea of reality itself being a game. All right? And so where we go from here is that we understand that the game model is actually a meta model. The game model is not competing with religion. All right? It's actually the structural component of the way religions are structured in themselves, that they seem to have an underlying pattern to how they are described. And so we have different, essentially, if we take this premise, we have an underlying game structure, and then we have different articulations of how that game works. And then we can call these models of reality or worldviews. And so then you have specific claims as to how the game works as well that each model will entail. And so at this point, this is where we're at. This is the logic of this investigation. Humans describe reality using structurally similar metaphors. That's number one. All right? So we're going to list these in a row so that you understand exactly where we're at. Number one, humans describe reality using structurally similar metaphors. Number two, those metaphors isolate certain dimensions. Number three, the modern game model seems to synthesize these dimensions. Number four, if reality inhibits these dimensions independently across history and civilizations, we may be tracking actual underlying structure. And that's what we're trying to get to. Number five then, and the final point is this. If that structure is real, if the game structure is real, it should leave evidence throughout not only history, but many different fields. We should be able to find evidence of it and better evidence in comparison, or more evidence in comparison to other meta models. All right? So, we made it to this point where hopefully this all makes sense to you, this investigation. I find it very interesting because if reality is in itself a game, then that could change so much. So now it makes sense to take our investigation to the next level, which means we need to go and see if reality itself does have a game-like structure in all the different areas of study. And that means we're going to be talking psychology, cognitive science, we're going to be talking quantum physics, we're going to be talking history, we're going to be talking religion. Is there actually the most evidence for the game model being the most evidence-based model when we take into consideration all the different factors? Is it really the best candidate out there for the best meta model of reality? Remember, we're not comparing it to religion. We're saying, or even really atheism or materialism or these things. What I'm saying is that the underlying structure that underpins all models of reality that are the most accurate may, in fact, be the game model itself. And that is the investigation we will take next. And my goal here is to just try to figure out what the truth is. What is the closest model to reality and meta model to reality? And I think right now, looks like the game candidate is a really solid one. All right, I'm Nick Zai, signing off for this What If investigation. Let's continue to explore. Let's investigate what reality actually is. And I think if we put enough minds to this, if we do this together, we can eventually move closer to the truth. If you have any questions, put them down below. We'll address them in future episodes. We'll see you in the next part of this investigation of the game model.